Hey guys, Jack here from leadmusician.com, hope you're doing alright. I have dropped together about 20 or so videos into one long video right here for you, which is a big long guide or introduction to music theory and composition at the piano. It's an excerpt from my larger course, which is about 11 hours on Udemy with the same title. You're welcome to check this out, and if you're interested, you can check it out on Udemy. The links are below. Enjoy. So welcome to the first episode in this tutorial series where we're introducing the fundamental idea of how music works, and I've called it the grid. When I get students in my private music studio who have never learned anything about music before, you may have, basically what we look at is a grid like this. What I want you to think of is music in terms of time going right on the x-axis and then going vertically on the y-axis in terms of pitch. So down at the bottom we'll have a beat going all the way through, on, and then going vertically we can place different notes to represent the pitch spectrum. Now it doesn't matter necessarily what scale, if you know already this grid is in, don't think like that at the moment, we'll get into the details of that later, just know that it's going higher and lower. So if we combine those, we have the grid at the bottom with the metronome, and then have notes, we can visualize music quite simply before we even start learning any theory or even touching an instrument. So thinking like a grid is a really important way to understand about how music works, whether you're playing a trombone, a church organ, piano, violin, cello, singing, composing a symphony, it really doesn't matter. Everything works like this grid, and thinking in this way allows us to do a number of things. Music becomes mathematical or logical. It's very understandable and quantifiable, and you can digest it therefore. So it's like a Lego-like way of thinking about music. And ultimately, we can think in patterns. So having a framework like this allows you to put your ideas anywhere. And if you understand the fundamental pattern behind an element in music, that really is mastery over that piece of material. Because to reach mastery, you really need a simple framework with simple parts that you can then build greater parts, like Lego, as I said. So everything that we do in the future through this course, simplicity is key. Think with everything, how does this work in the grid? Whatever you're learning, it will be describable in that grid, small block component way. The great news, of course, for film composers and anyone who's worked with a DAW like Logic or Reason or anything like that, is that this is kind of how you think about things with the piano roll. As an example, I'm just going to pull up a video of me playing very simple music from the first part of this course and overlay the piano roll on top. And you'll see that what's happening is that from left to right, obviously the piano roll is scrolling along and mapping what I'm playing up and down on the keyboard. Or you can phrase it another way, that the music's going up and down vertically on the DAW and I'm going right and left on the piano. Either way, we've got this relationship with the piano of up and down and then the actual visuals of the piano roll. And thinking like this is quite intuitive to most people who've worked with DAWs before. So actually you may have thought that this was kind of cheating before using the piano roll, whereas it's actually more truthful to how music is actually working when you're listening to it, compared to, say, music notation, which is a bit more of an abstraction. That being said, we do still need to learn piano, and it will give us a huge amount of dexterity and ability to compose and expand our compositional vocabulary, and learning it is absolutely the right step to improving your skill. So in the previous video, we looked at the grid, and I explained that it's one of the most beneficial ways to think about music and how it works. We presented time on the x-axis going continually from left to right, and then pitch on the y-axis going up and down. In this video, I want to take pitch and make it go horizontally. So we take out the time component and can start understanding something about the way that harmony is constructed, or at least the backdrop of this grid and what it's made out of. So instead of viewing it vertically, we're going to view it horizontally as a line of dots. What you just heard there was the chromatic scale, and it is every single note in order. In your DAW, it might look like this. Every single note in order is called the chromatic scale, as I said, and it is the background structure of the grid at its most basic level in Western music. As a little aside here, of course you can bend between notes, but certainly when you're learning the piano and learning about harmony, it's important to think of the background structure of the grid in quite a strict way. Going downwards, it sounds like a cartoon of someone falling off a cliff. And then if you play random notes from it, it's not particularly usable unless you want to create avant-garde contemporary classical music, which we are definitely not doing in this course. So let's have a look at that at the piano. I want you to take your finger and put it on one of the white notes and push it into the piano a bit more. And the reason I say that is so that you then start, if you go left or right, encountering the black notes. So here I'm moving up the piano, or right, and I'm encountering white, white, black, white, black, white, white, black, etc., etc. And what we're doing here is we're playing the chromatic scale, which is all notes in order. We're not missing any out. If I was to just play white notes, what I'd be doing is I'd be missing out all of those black notes, and I wouldn't be playing all of the notes on the grid. So get really good at playing this. You don't have to do the fingering that I'm doing here. You could just do this. And wander around a bit and get familiar with it. And once you are, what we can start doing is playing with something that we'll look at later called intervals. And intervals is just created by using spaces in the chromatic scale. So for example, we take this note and we go, let's say, 4 notes away, or 4 gaps away. 1 gap, 2 gaps, 3 gaps, 4 gaps. That's a space of 4 gaps, or 4 semitones. We'll come to know what that means later on as well. And then try and do that space from another note, perhaps this one. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's also 4 gaps. Now don't get confused here. It's very easy to, in the beginning, start on a note and count 1. But that's not 1, obviously, because it's just a space. That's like saying this is a meter, but it's not a meter. You need 2 things to measure a meter. So get good at moving that around. And what we're doing here is we're just touching on one of the most important things in music, which is the idea of patterns against a backdrop of harmony, or kind of the structure of the grid for us, which is the chromatic scale. Because when you get really good at understanding chords and shapes and composing, essentially, what that is just understanding the core pattern behind music. So you could take a pattern like this, which is a voicing, and then you move it somewhere else. Or you take a nice melody. Etc., etc. And it just, everything sort of drops away and you can start playing with patterns themselves. So get to know the chromatic scale, start playing with a few little simple patterns like a space of 4 or a space of 3 or 2, or maybe even a melody, very short one, and move that around across the grid. So now that we understand the structure of the grid which lies behind all music in regards to pitch, what we can do is we can learn the formula of different patterns or bits of material like the major scale, and then once we learn that actual formula, we can apply it anywhere. So for example, if we look at this is the chromatic scale. When we understand the structure of the major scale over the top of this, we'll be able to play every single major scale. So we're going from first principles. So we're going to play a first note, and then if we skip the next dot, which would be this note, but we don't play that note and we play the next one, it sounds like this. And that gives us a step of 2 semitones between these notes, the first one and the second one. So I'm going to grey out the notes in between as we do this. The next note would be another 2 steps, and then the next one is 1 step, and then the next note is 2 steps, 2 steps, 2 steps, 1 step. And that sounds like this. And we have created our major scale. Now, if you've looked at this before, you may know that a group of 2 semitones, so stepping past 2 notes in the chromatic scale, is also called a tone, and 1 step in the chromatic scale is called a semitone. So if I put those on here, we've got a gap of a tone between the first and second note, and then a tone between the second and third, and then a semitone between the third and fourth, a tone, 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 semitone. Understanding that formula allows you to move the major scale any way you want. Let me show you by zooming out a little bit. Here's our major scale. But because the chromatic scale is a perfect grid, we can just move it all up. So now that we've looked at the tone-tone, semitone on the grid or on the dots, let's apply it at the piano. We'll start, like everyone does in these kind of courses, at the C major scale, and then we'll go into other keys so that you can kind of understand the principle in a number of contexts and apply it wherever you want. So let's start here. We're going to go past the first dot and then to the next dot. So we've skipped a tone. Now we've got another tone to do, so we skip past the next dot and go to the following dot. After the first two tones, one tone, two tones, remember we're counting the spaces between these. It's very easy for people to, when they start this, go tone. But that's not a tone. That's like saying, this is a meter. It's not a meter. You need two things to measure a meter between. So we go tone, tone, then we go semitone, then tone, 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 semitone. I'll go over that again slowly. So tone from here to here, tone from here to here, then a semitone, then a tone, then a tone, then a tone, then a semitone. And that gives us our C major scale. That's our C major scale, which we can do tons of stuff in, which is what we're going to discover in this course. Let's do two more scales, the two scales that we're going to work primarily in this course. Let's go to G, okay? So here's G, and let's do the same thing. So we skip past the first dot, go to the next, that's a tone. Skip past the next dot, go to the next, that's another tone. Then we have a semitone, then a tone, then a tone, and then a final tone. Now, really important here to realize that when we're going from this note here, up a tone, that's not a tone, that's a semitone. So we have to go to this one here. And then one final semitone. So it goes like this. Tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. And then we have G major. Let's finally do F major. We go up a tone, then a tone, then a semitone. And here, this semitone leads us onto a black note. Then a tone, then a tone, then a tone, and then a semitone. So it looks like this. Tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. F major, and how to create your three primary major scales that we're going to use inside of this course. I would really get to know this like the back of your hand. It's an incredibly important tool, and not just to be able to work it out on the spot, but then to learn those scales and embody them so that you can do what I was doing there, just playing different patterns, which is essentially composing inside of a key. Really, really important point. Playing around with this, try it in other keys that aren't just C, G, and F, but other ones, maybe some scales beginning on black notes or some other ones that beginning on white notes. And these are all major scales. Remember, you've found out the fundamental formula for the major scale. It's our first step. In this video, we're going to go over how to create chords inside of the major scales. In the previous video, we looked at the structure of the major scale of tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. So then when we've got those notes that we've filtered out from the background chromatic scale, what we can start doing is building a chord from an initial note. Now, this is the root note of the scale, as you know. But what we're going to do is we're going to build a chord from the same note. So this is going to become the root note of that chord. And the shape goes like this. You play the first note, obviously, because that's the note that we're building it from. You skip the next note of the scale and go to the third note of the scale. And then you skip one more note and you go to the fifth. And we call these, of course, 1, 3, and 5, or the first, third, and fifth. But we can take that pattern and build that chord from another note. So let's now make that note the root of the chord. That will be 1, the 3, and the 5, or the root, the the third, and the fifth of that chord. We still have the root note of the scale in place. We are still in, for example, the scale of C major or the scale of G major, but we're building on a different root note. So there's two layers of numbers here that you need to be clear about. Here we're building it on the third degree of the scale, and it's the same structure, 1, 3, 5. As a little aside here, the astute of you would realize that when we played this first chord, due to the pattern of the major scale, the space between the first and the third, i.e. the root note and then the third of that chord, has 4 semitones in between it. Whereas when we played the second one, it had 3 semitones in between it. And whilst this is a bit too advanced to go deep into right now, just know that that's the difference between major and minor sounding chords. More on that later. So, this is the root note of the scale, and we call it 1. And that would be the second degree of the scale, third degree, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh. And then actually we'd get back to 1 again. And if you're not sure why, it's because the chromatic scale on any instrument has 12 notes. And once we get past the 12th note, we're back to the same one. So if we'd started on C as 1, C would be 1 again, right on the right-hand side of this page right now. So if we build a chord starting on degree 2 of the scale, that's the root note of the chord built on degree 2 of the scale. So we'd call it chord 2, but it has its own root note. So that's the root of that chord, the third of that chord, and the fifth of that chord. And if we move that here, it's the same, wherever you move that structure. So I hope that's helpful. I wanted to make this really clear, the differentiation between the degrees of the scale, or the key, and the degrees of the chord. And both of them are working at the same time. They're both true. You just need to understand them at the same time or side by side. So let's take that chord pattern and we'll apply it inside of your 3 scales that you've learned so far. So what we're doing is we're skipping 1 note. It's a bit like when we took the 12 notes of the chromatic scale and we skipped some of them. In other words, we're filtering out stuff. Again, it's another layer of filtering here. So that's the shape, and the way that it works is we play 1 note, we skip the next note of the major scale, play the next note, skip the next note, and play the next note. And that gives us a C chord. We won't go into whether it's major, minor, diminished, that sort of thing just yet in this video. We'll do that in later videos. For now, all you need to know is that this is built on this bottom note. And this is how you should think about harmony. Harmony builds up from the root, like a tree. We don't build harmony necessarily that way. Well, you do much later on. There's something called negative harmony, but absolutely not within the scope of this course. So we build up again, and this is our C chord. So if we just take that pattern like a kind of cookie cutter mold, right? And we apply it there on our root note of D, we're now playing a D chord, then an E chord, F, G, A, B, and C. And this is super easy inside of C major, right? Which is why everyone starts with C major, because you can understand this. As soon as we play other keys, you can see that there's a little bit more thinking going on in there, but the principle is exactly the same. You create the scale, regardless of the fact that you don't necessarily know that yet, it's still just going like this. Yeah, okay. So that's your C major scale, and that could be called C, D, E, F chords, but it could also be called chord 1, chord 2, chord 3, chord 4, chord 5, chord 6, chord 7, and then chord 1 again. Because we're always thinking relatively to this root note of this scale, wherever it is, yeah? And it doesn't work that way. We don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 when we're going down. It's always thinking up. So this would be chord 1, because it's C, and then this would be chord 7, because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's how we think about the chords inside of C major. Let's apply exactly the same thing inside of G major and F major. So here's our G chord here, because our G major scale goes, what we're doing is we're going play 1, skip 1, play 1, skip 1, play 1, and that gives us our triad shape. Triad because it's 3 notes. It's a standard form of harmony, really, really core to basically everything that you'll learn in music. That would be chord 2. Now, chord 3 here would not be this. Now, you might be wondering why, but the main reason is basically because we've already worked out the scale and we've realized that that major scale structure does not give us an F normal there. It gives us a F sharp. Again, don't worry about the names, it's more about the shapes. So that doesn't go there, it goes there. And that actually sounds a lot better. Similarly here, would it be that chord? It wouldn't, because we still need to integrate this F sharp, this note here, into the key. And lastly, this chord here, it wouldn't be built on F because we don't have an F in this key. We don't have this note in this key, so it's going to be built on that note. So I'll play it again. Chord 1, G, chord 2, A, chord 3, B, chord 4, C, chord 5, D, chord 6, E, chord 7, F sharp. Chord 1, 7, 6, 5, etc. Let's lastly do it in F. I'll whiz through this one because you probably know this by now. Here's your F major scale created from the tone-tone semitone pattern. We play the first pattern built on the F, the second pattern built on the G, integrating this new note. It's not that one because that's not inside of our scale. So get to know all the chords inside of this key, play them, in all of the keys, so in G, F, and C, and be able to play all of them all the way through going up and down. And you'll notice that you can start creating your nice chord progressions, right? You can come up with little ideas. I mean, it doesn't sound super fantastic or amazing at the moment, but this is the building blocks. We'll get to the nuance, the arrangement, and the voicings later on. But it's really important that at this stage you don't necessarily skip through too much, is that you can at least play every single chord inside of those three keys really quickly and be able to go, okay, chord 2 of F major, chord 5 of C major, chord 2 of C major, chord 5 of G major, and be able to do those quite quickly. So that's your practice. See you in the next video. So far we've been playing around with patterns and filtering out notes from the background of the chromatic scale. So we took this and we took that pattern of tone, tone, semitone and created a major scale. And then we took this pattern and moved it around that major scale, creating chords. And this is a theme that you'll come across again and again in music, that you take patterns and filter stuff out and you move them around, basically. Now, theoretically, you could keep composing without ever learning any note names, because really there's nothing inherently C about this. If I kind of explain what I mean, if you imagine that all humans disappeared off the planet and an animal came over to this piano and played this or this, or this, there's nothing around this note that is inherently C, F, or D. And it's really important to realize that the sound and the effect that we're hearing is not C, it's this shape against the backdrop of semitones, which is really important. However, especially in a course like this, it is really beneficial to be able to talk about harmony and give things names rather than just say that note, that note. So it's in this video that we're going to start learning all of the note names. So superimposed over the piano at the moment is the standard note names, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and you can see that it goes on up the piano forever and ever. And it's really important for you to start learning these so that immediately when you play a chord like this, you know it's some type of D chord, or this is some type of G chord. So we'll start with the natural note names first. And the best way to learn this is simply just to decide to learn one of them at a time. So you play D, and visually that's in between the group of two black notes, because obviously on piano we have this 3-2, 3-2 thing going on with the black notes. So you just play all the Ds on the piano like this, and out of shot I'm playing all of them as well, up here as well. And hopefully, even after sort of 10 seconds of doing that, that's going to be really clear in your mind, if you, maybe even if you say out loud D, D, D. And then you try another note, G, G, G. And do that with all of the notes of the alphabet, and then come back 10 minutes later or the next day and see how good you are at going G, straight to it. And the thing that you want to be aware of is whether you're counting up or down from other notes. So what I mean is, if I say where's D, and you in your mind go A, B, C, D, that doesn't count. It needs to be what we call an orientation point. This is really key, so that note there is your starting point, a bit like a landmark in a city. You know immediately where that is, rather than having to find directions to get to that place. Otherwise, everything that we do later, when I say play a C major 7 chord, you will be like, wait, where's C again? A, B, C. And it will slow down the whole process because you'll have this tiny little step that you have to do all the time before everything. So go away, learn all the natural notes, and then come back to this point in the video and learn all the sharp notes. So I'm assuming you've learned all of the natural notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, across the piano. Let's talk a little bit about how you name the sharp and flat notes. So if we take a really simple example, like D here. In music, we always have a sharp and a flat version of every natural note. And on the piano, the natural notes are really easy to see because they are just white. But really, if we were to think about it more theoretically, the natural note is just A or just B without any modifications of sharp or flat. So if we play D and we go in between these two black notes here, if I go down one note, that's going flat. So we call this note in relation to this one. We're calling it D flat. Or if we go up, we're going D sharp. Now, obviously the astute of you will realize, or you'll know already, that if we go to C and we go up one note, that's going sharp. That's the same note. So the important thing to realize straight away is this is just names, and the black notes have two names, right? So this is C sharp or D flat, and this is D sharp or E flat. So try and name some of the other notes on the piano, and then pause the video now, try and name some of the notes and come back and I'll explain one final little confusing thing. So the confusing thing that you probably discovered just then is, what about B sharp, C flat, E sharp, and F flat? There's no sharp or flat. Well, kind of. That's kind of true. Really, I want you to think of sharp and flat as not necessarily going from a white note to a black note. Because if you think about it, if you're playing trumpet or violin, there'd be no black or white element about this. And in fact, when you play a note on the piano, the fact that it's white or black doesn't matter to music, right? So the way that we go sharp or flat is from a natural note down one semitone. And a semitone, just as a little reminder, is that tiny little step that we learned when we did that chromatic scale. So technically speaking, although this is something that you don't really come across too much, if you go from this F down one little semitone, yes, that's E, but you could also call it F flat, and that would also be F sharp. So E sharp would also be F, and E flat would be that. Similarly, here's a B. It's very obvious that we can go B flat, but when we go B sharp, we get to this note. So this is called C usually, but you can also call it B sharp. Again, don't worry too much about that. You probably won't use it, certainly not in the rest of this course really too much, and you probably won't need it to even compose, but it's there in the background of your logic and understanding of the way that music works, so that later on you're not like, hang on, what on earth is that note? We'll also encounter it in the chapter where we talk about the circle of fifths. Okay, hope that was helpful. I'll see you in the next video. So I'm big on assignments in this course and in general. It's really important that as you're learning stuff, you really try and apply it. So not only in these assignments that I give you, but in your own work, try and take what you're learning and apply it straight away to composing your own work. As a suggestion, because we don't want to be too complex if you're kind of beginner at this stage, what we want to do is we want to do a simple ambient track. So if you're not sure about ambient music, it's kind of basically really slow. There's no tempo, therefore you don't really have to fit things together in the kind of the rhythmical grid in such a, you don't have to spend too much time thinking about it. It's quite floaty. So what I would like you to do is choose a pad or some kind of like instrument that's or synthesizer or strings or whatever, and try with your left hand playing simple chords in your DAW. So you just hit record, and then you might set these chords. Make sure you're performing or composing in a key. So here, hopefully you realize that I'm in the key of F major because we've got this B flat here. And you just hold these chords for ages, yeah? And then slowly move around to other ones. And then go back and record over the top, inside of F major again, a really nice slow melody, probably on piano with a nice bit of reverb. And you'll get kind of quite cheesy, but maybe quite lovely filmic sort of quality. And this is a really good starting point for you to realize that you're writing inside of a key, and just spend a lot of time, almost a bit like a meditation, really kind of getting to know the quality of the key. What notes sound well, what don't sound so good together, and just create a simple ambient track. You don't have to do anything with it. It's just kind of a bit of play. So I'll see you in the next video with a quick example. So we'll start this video at the piano, just a simple example of the ambient track and how you apply what you've learned so far in a compositional process, and then we'll go into the actual DAW logic and look at what I've done there. So one of the things that people often ask when they are thinking or evaluating whether they need to learn piano in order to up their compositional skill set is really that if you understand the theory of just the fact that we've got a chord here and a chord here and I'm playing notes over it, surely you can program everything inside of Logic. Well, yeah, that's true. And actually, depending on what you prefer, you must absolutely feel free to do that. But also don't underestimate the power of having this at your fingertips, literally at your fingertips, rather than at the end of the fingertip of a mouse or whatever you call it. It's a bit less of a musical feeling when you're kind of clicking and moving things around and doing things like that, to be able to just kind of yeah, and you can actually be more intentional. And as you build up your your oral training, you can start hearing the lines that you want and hearing the chords that you want. And it's a kind of a really nice process where everything starts to come together. Planning also away from the screen is a lot more creative. I find I get stuck very quickly if I'm sat at the screen. Whereas if I come to the other side of the room where the piano is, my DAW is over there, I kind of get out of my kind of producer mindset and into the composer mindset, and then I can go back and get in my producer mindset. So anyway, you saw I was doing some funny stuff there. Let me just make it a little bit more simple here. I'm going to play a chord in my left hand. And then over the top, I'm going to play a melody. And then I'm going to move to another chord in my left hand. And then another chord. So that's in C major. Let's try it in G major. Let's have a look in a DAW. So unlike some of the other tracks in this course, this particular example took me only a minute or two, because it's super easy to write atmospheric music if you haven't known this already. Basically what I've got here is one chord track, this patch here, which is basically just playing chords. Now if that looks a bit complex to you, let me zoom in, turn off this view here as well. What we've got is our simple triad shape going on there that you saw me playing a second ago, and then this one here. And then one of the notes carries on because it's the bottom of the next chord, and then the next chord, and then the next chord. There's a tiny bit of complexity where I'm just changing notes a bit before and a bit after, but basically what I'm doing is that triad, that 3-note chord shape, you can see changing every kind of, well, there's no bars really, it sort of just changes every now and again. And what then I've got on over the top of that is just me wandering around on the piano inside of the key, which is C major. And then all I've got at the bottom here, we'll hear those in a second, is just some notes backing up exactly what this is doing here. And you'll find that, especially if you put a load of reverb on your instruments, everything kind of just gels together pretty well. And it's a very easy way to write music by putting on a lot of reverb and writing something that's quite atmospheric, which is why I put it as our first exercise. So let's have a little listen, and I'll open up the tracks and look at different things that are going on as we listen. In this video, I'm going to talk to you about a concept which is absolutely core to understanding and using harmony and you composing pieces that make sense to you and also the listener. That is about gravity. We've thought about the grid and we've placed pitches vertically with the chromatic scale and then moving forward in time. What I want you to do in this episode is to think about the major scale transposed vertically onto this grid so that we can play melodies in it and think about where the center of gravity is. Now, be aware that it's not the chromatic scale as the backdrop of the grid now, but the grid is now made up of the major scale. So all of those notes that you're seeing there are now transposed to an equal grid. If we play the first note of a major scale, let's say it's this one, it's called the root note, or note number 1. And then if we go on up through the scale, when we get to number 1 again, what we have is another root note, and this creates a center of gravity. So note number 1 in the scale, wherever it is, however high or low, is our resting point. It's like arriving home. So if we play a melody, this will be quite evident. And then if we move that somewhere else, move the entire major scale up a few steps, then that center of gravity arrives somewhere else. And again, if we move the major scale to a different key, so obviously I'm just introducing the concept of this at the moment, and if you're a complete beginner, it's going to be a bit hard to understand. But I just want to sow a seed here and get you thinking about how harmony really works behind the scenes, because you'll have experienced this sense of gravity in music, even if you've never been consciously aware of it, and now you're going to be learning about the theory. So let me give you some examples, which you don't have to follow exactly theoretically, but for example, if we're playing here our center of gravity is that's our center of gravity. We feel at home there, like we've finished. And if I carried on playing that, you're getting a bit bored now, right? Because there's this sense of we're just there. And obviously this is planning stage, we're just at the piano, nothing's making sense yet in terms of the full arrangement, but there's something lacking there in terms of the harmony, especially if I was to carry on doing that for sort of like 2 minutes or something like that, because our sense of gravity is just in one place and we like gravity to move. So as an example, counter to that, what if I did we've got this new center of gravity now, and it feels a lot more like we've lifted, we've done something different. And again, if we did the same, we then were established here. There's something different now, we've moved back into another area. Now, again, you don't have to understand this totally, but the whole sense of, or part of this chapter, the purpose of this chapter is to get you understanding the idea of gravity inside of major scales and minor scales, which is diatonic harmony. And this idea is really, really important as we go forward. So I hope this chapter is useful to you, and I'll see you in the next video. So if a major scale creates gravity, and there are 12 different notes in the chromatic scale that we can start that major scale on, then that means that there are 12 centers of major scale gravity. And one of the best ways to visualize and use these different centers is through something called the circle of fifths. Now, initially that probably looks a bit complex, so let's take it away. Why are we learning this? Well, the circle of fifths is extremely powerful. Please don't be overwhelmed by the initial complexity. It allows us to make harmonic decisions when we really understand the circle of fifths. So you could kind of see it like our musical compass. It allows us to move and modulate and use different keys in a very effective way. And we're absolutely not learning it for the sake of music theory. That is completely not what this course is about. This course is a very practical course. So I'm giving it to you because it will enhance the way that you think about writing music. But the complexity for you, if you've never read music before, will almost certainly be coming from the bunching up of all these different notes and sharps and flat signs, particularly these, which are based on the stave with the treble clef and the different sharp signs on different note places. Now, let's just look at the top 3 keys. These might make a bit more sense to you because we've done these major scales. We've done F on the left, which has 1 flat, and you can see there's 1 flat sign. G on the right with 1 sharp, and that has 1 sharp sign. And C up at the top there doesn't have any sharp signs because there's no sharps or black notes on the piano in C major. So even though we're going to try and stick in these keys for most of this course, I still want to explain how the rest of the circle of fifths works in this video. So I'm going to make it a lot simpler and build the whole thing up from scratch. Here we just have a circle and the musical alphabet, and this is the best way to start thinking about it. We're going to start at C because it's our starting note with no, or our starting key with no sharps or flats. We'll put that at the top because it's the most simple. Now, if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, starting from C, that's going to get us a fifth away from C. We need to count upwards as well, by the way. So we're going to start at C and we're going to go through the musical alphabet, which is otherwise known as upwards in music. C1, D2, E3, F4, G5. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, be aware that we started at C, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is very different to what we did when we counted the spaces between the notes in the chromatic scale. Don't get confused because that will really not work if you count the spaces between notes. You see here, I've counted the spaces between notes and it's gotten us to A, which is very different. So we go C to G is a fifth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we put G around the circle of fifths at the next point. Let's do the same from G. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 gets us to D. We put that on the circle of fifths. Same with D, takes us to A takes us to E takes us to B, and then we fill out the rest of the circle, etc., etc. If you weren't sure what happened at this point around the circle of fifths just then, don't worry about it too much. That's a bit more advanced for now because we've got flat signs and we have to think about kind of the real interval structure of what a fifth is. Don't worry about that for now. Just think about the letter G, not the F sharp, and know that G is fifth away from D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then D flat is a fifth away from A, etc., etc. as we go around. So let's talk about key signatures now. These things on the right. Basically, they are just telling you which notes are sharpened or flattened, as you know, from your G and your F scale. So let's look at how that is built up. So if we start the major scale structure on G, then we end up with 1 sharp. As you know, our F sharp. And that's why G major on the circle of fifths has 1 sharp sign, like that. If we do the same with D, and you might want to pause the video and do this yourself now, you'll discover that D major with the major scale structure ends up with 2 sharps, C sharp and F sharp. And that's what we have. Same with A, 3 sharps. And that's what we have on the key signature. If we do the same left around the circle of fifths, we end up with flats. F major has B flat, and then B flat has B flat, obviously, and E flat. And E flat has E flat, A flat, and B flat. And it goes on round. So this is how the outer part, or the major part, of the circle of fifths works, and what we're covering in this video. Hopefully that makes it a bit more simple. But let's talk about the practical and useful function of thinking or using the circle of fifths. And that's really about this, that the keys that are next to each other are most similar, because nearly all of their notes are the same. C and F only have 1 note that's different, and that's B flat. Similarly with C and G, they only have 1 note that's different. That's F, or F sharp, when you're in G. And this makes it particularly easy to modulate or use notes or share gravity points with another key that's closest to it, because you're only moving gravity a short distance. And this is the really important point that I want you to start thinking about, that modulation is really moving gravity to a different place. So for example, if we're using just our G, C and F keys here, we can be playing a composition, and I'll stick to really simple triads at the moment. I'll try not to do any fancy voicings that confuse you. So I'll go up here. So it will sound a bit boring. Our center of gravity is very much in C there. But then if we change it to G, we've got our center of gravity now arriving at G, and we feel like we're happy to end there. So later in the course we get into modulation and shared keys, which give a kind of a much more interesting feel. But just play around with this idea of being at this certain point in the circle of fifths and then suddenly deciding to be in another key and creating the sense of gravity. And half of it comes from your mind as a composer, but half of it also does get through to the listener. That we are all unconsciously hearing, even if we don't know about music, where the center of gravity is, and the kind of tension and resolution around when we resolve that and where we push it around. So for example, if we're in F major, if we suddenly move to G major, and then to C, we create a kind of interesting shifting of gravity moving to different places. Now, that will probably be a bit overwhelming if you're a complete beginner at the moment. However, watch this video a couple of times, try out performing and creating chords in one key and then suddenly moving to another key, and just get a sense of where that gravity is lying on the circle of fifths. Always print it out, perhaps, would be a good thing, and put it on the top of your piano and play around with it there. So now we're going to look at the minor scale. If we were able to create such interesting kind of shapes and chords and melodies inside of a major scale, the minor scale is just basically giving us the same set of ideas but in a different flavor. Gives us a different quality of sound. Let's see what I mean here. Now, I could start with a line of dots like we did the major scale and say this is the chromatic scale and we're going to play this one, play that one, filter out that one in the middle, go to this one. But actually, there's a much easier way of doing this. Rather than learning a new formula entirely from scratch, actually you've got two for the price of one here, because the minor scale is contained inside of our major scale. And you already know this formula. So let me show you exactly what I mean first here in the presentation, and then I'll show you at the piano. So firstly, I'm going to zoom out, and we're looking here with the orange arrow at our root note. So that's the root note of our scale where we started our formula from. If we extend this obviously down, so we're going now down through the scale, which is repeating what we see on the right-hand side of the screen there, we go down 2 steps, and then we superimpose the C major scale over it. So if you'd done that in C major, that would have gotten us from C, B, A. And if we decide to treat this A note now as our center of gravity, just like we treated the C note when we were in the major, this becomes our relative minor scale. Let me show you this at the piano. So creating a minor scale isn't too hard when you know how it relates to the major scale. So to kind of reiterate what we just looked at on screen there, let's take one of your scales. Let's take the G scale. And so long as you're comfortable and familiar with that scale, all you need to do is go down 2 notes and start on E, right? G, F sharp, E. And then we have an E minor scale. Now, this is called the E natural minor. We won't go over the other types of minor until a later part in the course, but suffice it to say, natural is exactly the same as the major, as you can see here. But we've just shifted gravity to another place. So in a way, like when we were moving gravity of a major scale around, inside of a major scale, you can push gravity down to a different place. So here we have the root note being G major, but now we just decide, and again, this is about intentionality as a composer, you decide to move to a different place. And now we are saying, we're declaiming that E is our center of gravity. And that really, really affects the sound of the piece. It's sadder, to put it really simply. And major and minor, to put it really simply, is happy and sad. And if you're not quite sure whether something's major or minor, you can always ask yourself the kind of question, would this work well at a wedding? If someone was playing, it wouldn't work so well. You want something to be major. That's the major sound, right? So play around with the minor scale in terms of finding it from the relative major of G, C, or F. And what you'll find is you'll be working out 3 relative minor scales. So the relative minor of C major is A minor. The relative minor of G major is E minor. And the relative minor of F major is D minor. Now you can also, if you want, if you prefer to think in a different way, so this is one way, the way we're doing it here is we come up with a major scale with our formula and then we find the relative minor that belongs to it. But you could also then just learn the formula for the minor scale, and this is the really important point. This is why we started with the chromatic scale. If you can understand the structure of any content, any piece of content, whether it's a nice voicing or a scale or a melody, if you can understand it against the backdrop of the chromatic scale, you can apply it anywhere because everything works on the grid system. So the minor scale you could learn as tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone. So if you want to do it that way, then you can start on any note, tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone, and you can play that anywhere you want, and you're playing the natural minor scale. So have fun with that, integrate it, understand the relative minor and major and how that works, and maybe try learning the minor scale in different places as well, not just your 3 relative minors as part of this course. So now you know how to create a minor scale. You take your major scale formula and you go down 2 notes to what we call the relative minor. Then we basically decide to create gravity at that point. So we already know from a previous video that the circle of fifths is every major key laid out around a circle. But also inside of that key are the relative minors on the inside of that circle. Let's look at that now. So C major's relative minor is A minor, G major's relative minor is E minor, and F major's is D. And they share all the same notes. They're exactly the same notes, but they're just played starting from a different point and where we treat gravity from a different point. And the other thing is that the relationship of fifths, D to A to E, E to B, B to F sharp, is still in place. We still have a fifth between D and A and E and B, etc., etc. And this basically allows us to do the same thing with the minor keys because it's easiest to modulate to the closer keys because you're only moving gravity a short distance. So here, A, if you're in the key of A minor, you can move to E minor or D minor and use all the chords from that key. And this kind of answers one of the major questions that most people have when they're trying to compose in the beginning is like, what chords do I use? How do I move to a different place? How do I create a new section? How do I make something sound similar and work, but also be exciting and moving onwards? And this is one of the core elements of how you do this with harmony. So the closest keys to E minor are A and B, and same with B, which would be F sharp and E. F sharp minor's relative or close keys are C sharp minor and B minor. So really don't take my word for it. Go and try this out now, and then I'll show you on the piano. So with C, the relative minor is A, and inside of this circle, just below it, is A. And then to the right, we have G, and the relative minor of G is E, and underneath G, or inside the circle of G, we have E. So we can do the same thing that we did in that little exercise where we decided to write a piece of music that was using the chords of G, C, and F, or rather the keys of C, G, and F. We can do the same with our 3 relative minors, with A minor, with D minor, and also E minor. Okay? So you can write a piece of music that starts off in the key of A minor. And then you can move to E minor. And then you can move to D minor. Okay, now you saw me do unconsciously a few little inversions there. Don't worry about those for now. If you stick with your root position chords, in these compositions, that would be fine. But just realize it's exactly the same. We're deciding to treat gravity in a different place, and by moving gravity in the course of our composition, we create quite interesting harmony. I'm sure if you've studied piano just for a little bit, even maybe just the first few videos, you've realized that compositions sound a little bit static if we're just inside of one key all of the time and we don't do anything that's outside of the key. And the word for that is non-diatonic. So we've been writing stuff inside of the key and then shifting the center of gravity to a different key. But the important thing to realize is that you can't just go to any key. Not easily anyway. The best keys to go for in the beginning are the ones to the left and right, or clockwise and anti-clockwise around the circle of fifths. So because we're working with C, G, and F major scales and their relative minors, they share a huge amount of notes, right? If we look at C major, there's only, and then we look and we compare it to G major, there's only one note that's different, F, okay? G major shares all of these other notes, so it's actually quite seamless to move between these centers of gravity. If I was to do a scale like F major and then F sharp major, you can still make it sound good, but it's a very different quality, and you don't necessarily, it's not as easy to write good music. You have to think quite carefully. We will do that at some point. But suffice to say, stick with the three keys wherever you are. But if you notice that if you were kind of a bit further around the circle of fifths and you were doing, for example, D major, right? D major is very similar to G major, and it's also very similar to the one on the right of it, so which would be A major. Anyway, bit too much for this part of the video and this part of the course, but explore what we've just gone over there, and I'll see you in the next video. So hopefully by now you've gotten to know your G major, your F major, and obviously your C major scales and their three relative minors, and hopefully you're writing some more stuff inside of those keys with the chords and some melodies. I want to, in this video, talk about a kind of beyond the scope of this course goal, which is that you learn all major and minor keys. Now, before you kind of think that's kind of too much, I don't need that, let me give you an idea that there's only basically 12 notes, right? When you think about it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, before you get back to the same note. So remember, if you understand that part of the piano between my hands there, then you understand the whole of it, right? So if there are only 12 notes, there are only 12 major scales, and if there are only 12 major scales, there's going to be 12 relative minors of those majors. And that's the primary kind of realm of diatonic music. That's the bulk of stuff that you hear on the radio or on Spotify or whatever. It kind of doesn't necessarily go into the filmic realm. Some elements of filmic music don't, use just diatonic harmony, and certainly jazz definitely uses a lot more. And of course, those are very big genres there. They don't really mean anything, but at least for the first part of this course, diatonic harmony is the best thing to understand. But for your 6-month goal of learning kind of all of those keys, what that's going to give you is the ability to not only go through the rest of this course when we start doing bitonality, modulation, upper structures, all of those, and chord relationships, all of those things that require a knowledge of different keys and scales, but it's also going to just mean that the whole thing of theory, the whole obstruction of theory drops away, and you can start playing around with patterns like you would in the piano roll or on some kind of like iPad app that allows you to make music really easily, but it's just coming from you at the piano. That's the goal of it, that the theory and the keys drop away and that it's just the music and your content which is left. So just take your tone, tone, semitone and start on any note. Or if you want to make it a bit easier in the beginning to get to know these keys, you could follow the circle of fifths. So if we're going clockwise around the circle of fifths, and we've done G, right? The next one is going to be a fifth away, so that's going to be D. So you play the D major scale, and do these for 2 octaves, just like I'm doing here. You can look up the fingering online. If you just put in D major fingering piano or something like that, you might get some not so reputable sources, but there are plenty of things online. You can buy a scale manual from ABRSM on Amazon, has a good one. So. And then downwards as well with the D major scale, get really good. And then more around the circle of fifths, so the next one round would be A major, etc, etc. If we were going to go left around the circle of fifths, going down from F, it would be B major, or sorry, B flat major, right? And get to know all the chords in those scales, just in their simple root position, voicings. And then try playing your chord progressions that we've done so far, things like 1-5-6-4 or 1-4-5 or 2-5-1, really, really simple bits, right, inside of those keys. So here's 1-5-6-4 in B flat major. Obviously I'm doing really simple voicings here, and here it is in A major. And then here it is in F sharp major. And then start playing around with simple ideas inside of all those keys. So for example, here's a simple idea in D minor, right? And then here it is in A minor. And here it is in E flat minor. Right? So these ideas are translatable and movable, and when you move them, that's composing, you know? So 6-month goal, learn all keys, and I'll see you guys in the next video. So in this assignment, you're going to get really good at moving ideas and patterns into different places. So first of all, start off in C major to get used to this, and take a pattern over a chord. So the way that you want to think about this is in relation to the root, not of the scale, so that's the root, the start of the scale, but the root of the current chord that you're on. So here you're on a D chord, and the root note is D. So your melody could go 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. Then you'd move to another chord in this key, so chord 5. Chord 3. And some things will sound better than others. And just come up with patterns, maybe make more adventurous patterns, so like 5, 1, high, 3, low, 2, 1. 5, 1, 3, 2, 1. And I'm calling that 1 because you have multiple ones in different octaves. So once you've done that for a while, then take patterns and move them into different keys. So what you're doing here is you're transposing into another key. If you ever heard that word and wondered what it meant, it basically means taking the same pattern and moving it into another key. So really simple example inside of C major, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. If we go into G major, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, and in F major, 1, 2, 3, 2, 1. But what I want you to do is to transpose your chord sequence. So say you're playing chord 1, 5, 6, 4, a very famous chord progression. I want you to be able to then do that in 2 other keys. So in G major it would be 1, 5, 6, 4. And in F major it would be 1, 5, 6, 4. And over the top of that you could maybe add a little melody. For example, you could be like, maybe your pattern is 3, 2, 1 over the chord that you're currently on. So 3, 2, 3, 2, 1. Then move to another key. Or F major. And you see we're starting to compose, right? So this is all very simple sounding, but it makes a bit of sense, right? Because the ear is hearing a pattern move to different places. And actually when you start to analyze good melodies and good songs that you like, this is quite often what they do. Not all the time like that. If we just kept on moving that pattern around all the time, everyone, even if you've never studied music before, would find that quite boring. You'd start to realize it. But with a little bit of it, it adds a certain sound, kind of sense of cohesion in your music. So it's a good idea to kind of start using this. So play around with this in your different keys, take your patterns and move them to different places. And thinking about these 2 layers, you've got the backdrop of the key itself, with this as your root note of the key, but then the current chord that you're on also has its own root. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of F even though we're in C major. And hopefully that'll yield just a few interesting results and some cool ideas. But you can see that we're on our way. And this is the important thing to think when you're composing, is think of stages. Quite often the illusion or the kind of temptation when you're working with the DAW and you have loads of amazing synthesizers and production tools is to believe that you can throw some stuff down and it will sound amazing straight away, especially when you're using loops. But this is an iterative process. You add stuff together. So trust the process, learn this, and play around with it until it becomes really comfortable. So at this point in the course, you've done a lot. You've learned about major scales, minor scales, you've learned about the circle of fifths and gravity, and you've learned about chords in those scales, and you've moved patterns around. So that's a lot of stuff to be doing already, and hopefully you've been coming up with some interesting compositions or stuff in your work that uses the material we've done so far. What we've also done is laid a fantastic foundation for all of the many videos that are to come, all about more extensive, interesting harmony for your compositions. But what I want to do in this video is give you a bit of inspiration and say that what we've learned so far is kind of enough to be doing a lot with. If I can kind of explain by doing this video, basically what I do in the following video is show you a simple composition that I've done just using the principles that we've done so far. So diatonic, so inside of a key, just using those chords and playing patterns inside of that. But I use a few techniques that I'm sure you'll be aware of as a producer or a songwriter that basically pull those chords and melodies and arrange them on different instruments in interesting ways. Now, arguably speaking, what I've done here is I've written a piece of music using pretty much only the harmonic knowledge that we've learned so far. It's in the key of D minor, and it only uses the key of D minor and the notes in there. And it pretty much just uses root position chords. There are a few things going on like long held notes that join the chords together. That's a principle that we'll learn later on in the course. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play it through first, and then we're going to rebuild the track so I can talk you through the whole thing. Okay, so it sounds maybe quite complex if you're a beginner. Let's dive in and show you exactly what's going on. So first of all, let's start with this felt piano here. What I've got going on, and this is the thing that I'd invite you to do if you're working with a DAW like Logic, which has MIDI effects like arpeggiators. What I've basically done is I've turned the arpeggiator on and done the settings that I like. Obviously, it's not within the scope of this course to talk about Logic or arpeggiators, but you can find many things like that on Udemy and other, and of course YouTube and stuff like that. So basically all the arpeggiator does is take the note that you're playing or notes that you're playing and repeats them in a certain order. So here I'm just holding D, and what it's doing is it's playing it in 16th notes, and I've changed the velocity a little bit. I'm going to close that now so it doesn't confuse us, but if I now play other notes, if I bring up my little app here, my Chordy app, you'll see what I'm doing. Now if I move to another chord, that sounds pretty close to a piece of music, or part of a piece of music at least. And this is the important thing as a producer and composer. What you need to realize is that you actually have lots of things in your DAW often that can help you compose, i.e. you just create the chords and then it kind of lays out roughly what you're doing in an interesting way. That's particularly good with arpeggiators. So that's what I've got going on for the felt piano here, and I've combined that with a clock sound. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy that clock sound across and put it here, and then I'm going to perform the piano over the top again, which I kind of just did by improvising. this is doing is, particularly this is quite a filmic track, it's creating a kind of sense of tension underneath, but because I'm playing different notes, there's enough kind of like differentiation and it's kind of creating the sound of another chord, especially if I went. So that's basically what's going on underneath there. We're going to leave the brass and strings for a second. The other little aside that it's worth mentioning is, of course, you need to have a sense of production skills and also some good instruments. And I'm using trusty Spitfire Audio orchestral samples here, which I find absolutely amazing. With just a simple, just a simple note, you can get the sound of just the most beautiful performance on trumpet. So really, really good stuff to be using there. So I'm going to go straight up to these tracks here, because that's the bulk. A bit, if you remember in our ambient track, what we did is we played certain chords over with a pad. That's essentially what we're doing here, but with a string pad. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold a D minor chord here. If I change to chordy, you'll see what I'm doing. And then up to chord 4. So when I show people this for the first time, it's kind of the first thing should be, hey, it's quite easy to compose. Yes, it is really easy to compose music like this in some ways. You're just building on these simple blocks and thinking about patterns. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay that down now. I'll try and keep chordy up whilst I'm doing it so you can see what I'm doing. Occasionally I might change one note in the chord, like A might move down to G, just to add a bit of tension, and then I'll move up to the G chord, and then back down to the D chord. And now I'm just leaving out the A from the top of that chord, and then I'll leave out the F. So we just end on a long D. So that's what's going on there. I'm going to leave this secondary Evo. I kind of did that for various reasons. And then I'm just going to add in, oh no, sorry, we've got the brass and the strings. So basically what these guys are doing, if we just solo them over here, is they're kind of adding rhythmical tension. And essentially all they're doing, if you combine them both together, I've arranged part of the chord in the strings and part of the chord in the brass. What you end up with is the same chord of that's being played in the strings. So the chords are kind of following each other. So here, I can't remember exactly what I did, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a rough idea, the same thing with the strings, so that it's following what's going on. And I'm going to leave it there, just not do the whole thing just for your sake of time. Let's try and do the same with the brass. And let's leave that there as well. And then all I'm doing, this is all in the scale of D minor, which you know so far. I'm just going to play random notes in the trumpet inside of D minor. Let's turn off this metronome. get the idea. So it's really, really fun to play around with. It's kind of the next stage. We've got some rhythmical content. We're thinking about the grid of rhythm here, and we're a bit more clear about where, well, not in this one here, but a bit more clear about where we're changing chords. So I was changing kind of every 2 bars there. So, but compared to our ambient track, we're just a bit of a step forward now. You can see how it's kind of coming together. So if you could create kind of a track like this, that'd be really, really useful to you at this point, I think, to kind of feel a lot more confident that, you know, all of this stuff that I've learned so far is directly applicable. You don't have to do it in a filmic style like I have. That's just my natural tendency. You could do it in any genre that you're after. Of course, your instrumentation, your rhythms are going to change, but the harmony, arguably at this stage, is going to be basically the same idea. You're going to be playing triad chords inside of these scales and playing a melody on top of that. Cool. I'll see you guys in the next chapter. Have fun. So far we've created a major scale. We've understood the structure of the tone and semitone in that major scale or major key and applied it to different places on the chromatic grid. We've also then found that each of those major scales has inside of it a relative minor scale, and we've learned how to find those. And we've also learned the structure of the minor scale so that you can find that from scratch without having to find a major scale. Once we've found those scales, what we've done is we've understood that there are different degrees of that scale, and that on each of those different degrees we can apply a chord shape, which is otherwise known as a triad. And that basically builds on the first note, whichever note we choose of that scale, and we build up, skipping a note each time. We can move that to different places as well. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at each chord inside of a major scale and then a minor scale, and we're going to discuss and get to know the qualities of each chord because they're slightly different. In a major key, chord 1 is always major. Now when I say always, I really do mean always, because remember, the background structure of the chromatic scale is a perfect grid. So when you move the major scale to different places, the same structures live there. So chord 1 of every major scale is always major. Chord 2 is minor. Chord 3 is minor. Chord 4 is major. Chord 5 is major. Chord 6 is minor. And chord 7 is diminished. Don't worry about what these mean, we'll get to them later in the course. But for now, let's just talk about the qualities. If I say something like, the major chord is happy, bright, positive, or uplifting, those are pretty general and generalizations. You might not agree with it totally, and there are plenty of places in music where a major chord sounds really ominous and maybe sad, and a minor chord sounds particularly happy or hopeful. That's a very, very different kind of thing. We're talking very plainly and generically here, but there is some truth to it. So let's just stick with this for now. Minor chords are, to an extent, sad or empty. Some people say they're dark, atmospheric. Chord 3 has the same quality. And then as we get to chord 4, it's major again. Chord 5 is major again. Chord 6 is minor again. And then chord 7 is, I don't know, let's call it creepy, distorted, funky, or just quirky. It's not quite minor, it's not quite major, it's a bit different. So that's a major key. Let's look at a minor key. And just to remind you, the way that we find a minor key is by this page here. We either start on a note and think of tone, semitone, tone, tone, semitone, tone, tone, which gives us the minor scale, the natural minor, or we find a major scale through our normal tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone, and we find the relative minor. Either way, it's exactly the same. The natural minor scale has these chords. Chord 1 is always minor. 2 is always diminished. 3, major. 4, minor. And then we get to chord 5, which is an interesting one. You'll understand a bit more why this is a bit different at chord 5 in a minor key later on in the course. For now, I'm just going to say it can be minor or major. It's minor when we just do chords inside of a key, but sometimes chord 5 is altered. More on that later. Chord 6 is major, and chord 7 is major. Chord 1 is sad, empty, dark, minor. Then we have diminished straight away on chord 2, major, chord 3, minor, minor or major, major, major. So maybe you could pause the video now and go and understand these inside of the scales that you know and see whether what I'm talking about actually makes sense and whether you agree with it. You might not, which is also great. Get to know the sound of your color palette, which is the major and minor scale. You must really understand the qualities of these chords, and the more that you connect your feelings or emotions to these chords inside of different keys, the greater your skill and connection as a composer or writer or songwriter will be. So in the final part of this video, what I'm going to talk about is how to name chords. Naming chords helps us understand their function inside of a key, but you absolutely don't need to know them. This is just something I'm including in the course for comprehensiveness and because it'll probably come up. So we'll look at the same scale. Now this works in both major and minor. We call them exactly the same. It doesn't matter whether it's a major or minor scale. Chord 1 or note 1 are called the same thing, the tonic. Chord or note 2 is supertonic, then mediant, subdominant, dominant, submediant, and then the leading note or leading chord. Now this is a funny one. Many people call it the leading chord or note. I actually prefer the subtonic note or subtonic name. It makes more sense to me because it's sub to the tonic. Anyway, these aren't super important. You don't necessarily come across them all the time, and like I say, you can create music without them. However, there are 3 that I want you to be aware of, particularly these ones: the tonic, subdominant, and dominant. And the reason is because they're known as our primary triads. And the reason that they're called primary is because that they're particularly powerful in establishing the gravity of the scale or the key. So let's look at this at the piano. So I mentioned there about the power of establishing gravity in a key. So you understand the idea of gravity so far, but the chords that create gravity are not created equal, in the sense that some chords create gravity more than others, right? And those primary triads, chords 1, 4, and 5, are most classically the ones that we can establish gravity with. So if we start off by playing this chord here, it's an F chord, right? But because we know a few scales now, we know F major and we know C major, we also know D minor, the relative minor of F major, and also A minor. This chord right now could be in any of those keys, so we don't know where our home center is, i.e. where our center of gravity is what I mean. So as soon as I play chord 1 and then 4 and then 5 of F major, we have a sense now, not just theoretically because we've got this note in it which we know only belongs in F major and D minor, but we have a sense because of the structure of those chords that we're now home, right? And this is a really important point because we played chord 1, 4, 5, and it's created this sense of homeness, right? If we did it in another key like G major, what's chord 1, 4, 5 of G major? If you want to pause the video now and work it out. Basically, what they are G is 1, C is 4, D is 5, and now we're happy to land at G. So if I do that again from F major, we now feel that is our home center, but if I do the same now in G major, we suddenly feel that G is our home center. So this touches on a principle which we'll learn later, which is about modulation. But for the moment, just know that your primary triads, both in major and minor, create this real strong sense of gravity. So these names will help you understand and familiarize the feelings of each of these chords inside of these keys. So whilst I said you don't need them, I personally find them quite valuable because when I put a name on something, it allows me to label it, and then kind of that locks it in my mind more. As a composer, I know that, oh, okay, it's a bit like saying if you're a painter and you didn't call it red, pink, blue, but you just used the colors, right? There's something useful about calling it red, blue, or pink, and that's what's going on here. So you go, okay, so you think, okay, well, we've been using chord 1 for a while, the tonic. Maybe I want to move to the supertonic. And now I want to use the primary triads to establish the key. And now I'll go to the submediant, because I know that's the minor sound, and then go down to the primary chord 4, and then to chord 1. So experiment with these names and get to know them a little bit, for the sake of theory and some stuff that we do through this course, but also because it might be beneficial for you in the way that you compose. And I'll see you in the next video. So 2 quick resources that I want to share with you at this point. Well, really one resource, which is hooktheory.com. And then the first of those resources is this theory tab here. So this is a really, really useful way of understanding the theory behind songs if you've never looked at this sort of thing before, without going too deep into kind of music theory and stuff like that. You can visualize it much like we have the piano roll in our DAW, and we also start to have the numbers of chords underneath here, except they're written in Roman numerals here. So Roman numerals, if you're not sure about them, you can look them up online. Basically, it's just a way of counting in symbols. Makes it a lot clearer in some ways. And then you've got the actual names of the chords here as well. It's a really, really useful resource. You can just click on one of these songs and go even deeper with it and let it play and understand what's going on. Now, if you're unsure what a theory tab is, they've got a really helpful explainer video on this homepage which goes through it. And I would explore the different things that they have in their library. Some things here that somewhat less applicable to some people maybe, and then some other ones, for example, for film composers, actually a lot more interesting material. And you start to realize that actually, even though Taylor Swift sounds like Taylor Swift, and Game of Thrones sounds like Game of Thrones, underneath the harmony is, doing similar things. Not exactly, but it's not necessarily the harmony that creates the genre. It's very much more all of the other stuff. So harmony can be learnt universally, even from songs that you might not necessarily like. The other resource is something from their blog. This is done quite a while ago by Dave Carlton, but basically what he did is he kind of basically crunched numbers on over 1,000 songs and kind of basically looked at the data of it and asked certain questions like, are some chords more commonly used than others, common chords, and what chord is most likely to come after this chord, what are the most common keys. It really, really answers a lot of questions that I know students have in the beginning about, hey, what's my basis? What's the standard stuff? Because it's not like we're trying to be standard, but if you know what the kind of central core styles and conventions are, what you can do is then build upon them. So you can find them by going to the URLs in both of these pages. This one's a bit of a long one. I just actually found it by searching Google. I analyzed 1,000 chords, and even though that's not 1,000 there, it found it. But really the most important principle that I want you to take home with this blog article in particular is not that you need to just read this blog article. It's that by analysing hundreds of tunes, you gain more perspective as a composer. You build up more material and more conventions and understandings about the way that harmony works. Unfortunately, just reading Dave Carlton's article isn't going to give you a massive working knowledge of harmony. You're going to see a few conventions. Absolutely do read this. It's very useful. It'll get your head into it. But one of the most important things, just like learning all keys was a long-term assignment that I've set you beyond the scope of this course, also, I would say that learning at least 20 or 30 different songs or tunes that have different types of harmony in it is going to be super valuable for you, because then it's a bit like learning words and language and stories, that eventually you become more and more articulate. So really, really put that as a goal. Unfortunately, I don't think I will give you the right songs to do, because that would just be wrong. It won't make sense, because the right songs for me might not be the right language for you. If I'm telling you to learn loads of Spice Girls or whatever like that, then you're going to be not learning the right music for you. So basically, you don't need to start it yet. Carry on through this course and you'll understand how to learn and find all the chords to all the songs that you're interested in. And then by the end of this course, then you can start really kind of making a practice of learning more and more tunes. So hopefully one day you might even know up to, a few hundred tunes, not necessarily that you can do off by heart, but that are in your unconscious and therefore will be coming out through your compositions. Hopefully that's useful in this stage, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to start talking more about common chord progressions at the piano. So 2 more resources from hooktheory.com. They're an absolutely brilliant website with just so much good stuff has come from analysing this huge database, and this is exactly what I was saying. This kind of knowledge will become natural to you once you've studied lots and lots of different songs, but for now you can actually interact with this database and kind of make some of the distinctions that would come after learning many songs yourself after a long time. So it's really, really useful. So this one, which you can see at hooktheory.com/trends, allows you to ask the question, what chord is most likely to come after this one? And you can choose which key. So we've been working in C, G, and F. So you could choose those. And as you learn more scales, you can change here. And it allows you to say, okay, well, I've played an E minor chord, which is chord 3. What's most likely to come after E minor? And what's less likely to come after E minor? So here, the most likely chord to come after E minor, as we've seen so far, is F. And then you can actually click on one of these songs here, and it'll show you the analysis of that song, and you can see it in action. So here we are at E minor in the fourth bar of this song, going to F, and then you can listen to it there, and then you can play it. You can also then change the key of it and learn that in all keys. So absolutely brilliant resource to get sort of contextual advice. So in other words, really non-theoretical advice. It's not just abstract from songs. You get to listen and read the songs and understand how the chords work in context and why they work. The other one is the common chord progressions page, and you can find that under the software and then progressions, or you can just find this through the URL up on the screen now. Now, there are 4 different tabs here. We have beginner level famous chord progressions, intermediate 2, and advanced. Obviously, these ones at this point in the course are going to be a bit tricky for you, but by the end of this course, my aim is that you'll understand everything in this whole page here. So, beginner, if we open that up, what we see is their standard player here, where you can interact with the actual chord progression, and all of the songs that use that progression. So here we have the 1, 5, 6, 4 progression, the really famous one. And then we go down and we can encounter Pachelbel's progression, 1, 5, 6, 3, 4, and then many others. So I would get into this page and really understand the chords that are in this beginner tab. And as I say, by the end of this course, hopefully you'll be able to understand all of the other ones inside of intermediate and advanced. So hopefully by now you've been getting into the hook theory blog and also the different chord progression or the standard chord progressions that I showed you in a previous video. I want to add just a few of my own notes as well, because there were some progressions or principles that weren't covered in the standard chord progressions. Understandably, because what they've done is they've derived those distinctions from a large database. But there are a few more things that I think I can add. So the core thing that's really important to understand when you're working inside of a key, which is called diatonic. So if I'm inside of C major, anything that I play outside of the key, like these black notes, most obvious to see with C major, that's non-diatonic. Whereas if it's diatonic, it's in the key. Similarly with G major, that's all diatonic, but if I play that note, that's non-diatonic because it's not in the key. So with all diatonic kind of harmony, the most fundamental kind of progression is chord 1, chord 5, and then chord 1 again. It's this relationship between 1 and 5. And you'll hear the word dominant sometimes, and that's because we call this the root, and then this the dominant. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you hear it all the time. So for example, if you end a concert, that's going 5, 1. Very important relationship. Let's go back into C so you can see that. That's 1, 5, 1 inside of C major. The other one is 1, 4, 1. And these chords, 1, 4, and 5, are called our primary triads. Triad because there are 3 notes, it's built up of thirds, and primary because they're the most important in a sense. You could say important in inverted commas, but they're called the primary triads of a scale. And it works the same in a minor scale. Here's A minor, here's chord 1, at chord 4, and chord 5. For various reasons, I'm not going to play that. If you know a little bit about theory, sometimes we do that. Let's just call these our primary triads for now. So inside of all of your chord progressions, thinking about 1, 4, and 5 is quite important. They're really powerful chords. But beyond that, for example, the 1, 5, 6, 4 progression, our first note goes, our first and second chord go 1 to 5, and then the 6, and then the 4. You could also do 1, 6, 4, 5. That's another famous one. And again, I'm keeping my playing really simple at the moment. When we get into the voicings and everything like that, it'll sound a lot more interesting. Everything's a bit simple at the moment. But that's just because I'm making sure that everyone can follow stuff. So the other thing to think about, final thing really, for common chord progressions or conventions is not just the 1-5 relationship and the 1-4 relationship, but also the circle of fifths relationship. Because if we go around the circle of fifths, for example, we go from D, which is 2 steps to the right from C, if we're staying in C major, so a fifth away from D, left round the circle of fifths, to G, and then back to C, what we're doing is a secondary fifth. So yes, G is a fifth away from C, but also D is a fifth away from G. So we have this kind of fifths movement. So we go a fifth away from G and then a fifth away from C. And that gives us, if we stay diatonic, so all the chords, not D major, but D minor, if we play this, it sounds like this. And that's called a 2-5-1 because that's chord 2 and that's chord 5 and that's chord 1. And this is just hinting at something that we'll get to much later in the course, which is called secondary dominance. The secondary dominant allows us to get a dominant to G and then a dominant to C. So D is acting as a dominant to G and then G is acting as a dominant to C, and that gives us a really nice sound. So that's the circle of fifths and how you could think about that. If we extend that even further, if we go right round the circle of fifths all the way to E, don't worry too much about trying to understand this and don't make it more complicated than it is. Really just see it as going around the circle of fifths. And that would sound like, if I put some nice interesting voicings to it, it would sound like... Final thing that I just wanted to reiterate about the principles that came from the hook theory research is that chord 3 is a tricky chord to manage. And you'll notice from the data when you read those articles is that chord 3 is quite tricky to move from chord 3 to another one. It doesn't often sound as good as you might hope. Some songs really make it work, but just be aware that chord 3 is a bit tricky. If we go from C, for me, that chord progression really doesn't work. It's a bit weak. From here to here is okay. From 1 to 3 is fine. But then that's kind of a bit of a letdown somehow. Again, that's not just my opinion. You've got to use your own ear. But just be aware of that managing chord 3 is quite important, and certainly chord 7, because what we've got is, it's called a diminished chord. Don't worry about what that means yet, but it's a bit of a strange shape there. So 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6 are your kind of real standard chords when you're writing diatonically. I want to add one more thing here, which is about tension and resolution. And that principle in composition and writing anything is really important. It's also important in any other type of art that uses time. So for example, a film, you have a character who starts out and she maybe has an event. So it starts out okay, and then there's an event that happens, an inciting event, and then she goes on a journey and kind of finds something, has some struggles, and then ends. So you've got tension and then resolution as a big story arc. You have resolution at the beginning, or kind of ease, some tension, and then it resolves. That's the classic story arc. And in chords and harmony, that's often what we're looking for. If I just played a song all the time that was like, forever and ever, it would get really, really boring, because those chords, chord 1 and chord 3, are quite relaxing, right? They don't feel like we're going anywhere. Whereas if I do this, chord 1 to 2, we feel like we're about to travel somewhere else, and particularly with chord 5, if I suddenly stop there, you're like, no, I need something else to happen. It's about an expectation. So it's this balance of tension, here, tension, resolution, but not totally, and a bit of tension because we want to go back to here to resolve again. So be thinking about that when you're constructing these component parts from the standard things that I just went over and are also present in the hook theory pages, and think about tension and resolution and how effective that is for what you're trying to do as a composer. So a quick principle here about changing standard chord progressions. Because if I was you and I was just starting out and I was just hearing me speak about all this, I'd be thinking, why am I learning all these standard chord progressions? I kind of want to get into kind of more interesting stuff, or how is that me writing my own thing? Well, like I said, once you internalize these, you end up putting them in your own order. And as you see, there's only a limited set of chords. So actually, everyone does repeat and copy each other. But one idea, if you're still not satisfied with that will help you, is the idea of changing something 30%. So let's take the 1-5-6-4 progression. change maybe one part of that, right? So instead of going to 5, let's go to 2, right? That's suddenly different. Now, obviously someone will have written that chord progression before. You can't get away from that. Your uniqueness and sound does not come at this level. This is like the building block of how the piece works. All of your nuance comes in, arrangement, you know, production, vocals, everything. But making this kind of difference is more satisfying to you because you know that you've done a bit of composing rather than like taking a block and going, boom, I'll use that standard chord progression. This idea of 30% difference. So if there's a song that you really like the sound of and you're like, God, I really like that sound. Well, keep the elements of it that you really like the sound of, right? Say it's 1, 6, 4, right? Say you like that bit, but you don't want to go to 5 because that's like the standard 1, 6, 4, 5 progression. You could try something else. Just change the 5 bit. Now, don't worry too much about what I was doing there if you're a complete beginner at piano. We will cover everything that I was just doing in terms of voicings later on. But what I was doing was I was very much playing chord 1, 6, 4, and then 1 again, right? But I just did a different arrangement at the end. But you see there, I'm kind of taking something that I really like in an existing song, turning it 30% and making it my own. So that's your assignment for this part of the course, is take a number of songs that you find or a number of these progressions and then change them roughly 30% and then make it your own. So when you're playing chords in a key and you're in a minor key, one of the things that often gets a bit confusing is what to do with chord 5. I've probably mentioned that in a few videos before, because it can be a minor chord or a major chord. So let's look at that now. Let's look at it in A minor, which is the relative minor of C major. We're going to go chord 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's chord 5 if we're playing it purely in the diatonic way, i.e. only using the notes from the scale. But I've probably mentioned before that what you can do with chord 5 is you can take this middle note and move it up a semitone. And that gives it a slightly more powerful sound when you're moving between chords. That note there is a semitone away from the root note of the key. So it gives it more power in moving back to that chord 1 there. If I play chords 1, 4, 5 with the natural version of chord 5, so where we don't change the middle note, I'll play that first and listen to the sound. And that's still a great sound. There's many, many tunes that use that. But if I do it now with there's something about the preparation of that last chord that has more tension. And it's to do with that note, which then resolves in a semitone. So what we're doing there is we're turning it from chord 5 being a minor chord, and you'll learn exactly how minor and major chords work later on in the course, to a major chord. Yeah, let's do it in the other 2 keys. Let's do it in D minor. Chord 1, chord 2, chord 3, chord 4, chord 5 would become, so if we play chords 1, 4 and 5 in D minor, and let's do it in E minor, chords 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's what it would look like if it was in our standard minor or the natural form, but we take the middle note, we move it up a semitone. So we go 1, 4, 5, 1. And you'll see this in the common chord progressions that I give you in the harmony cheat sheets in this course, and also beyond, outside of this course, in kind of chord analysis, and you'll see I'll teach you how to read all of those, but the thing to realize is that when you're on chord 5, which is often written with a V, it will be written with a capital V if it's the major, or a lowercase v if it's the minor. And it creates a very, very different sound. So if we, one of the chord progressions we study later on in the course is Hans Zimmer's time which is a piece from Interstellar? No, Inception. I get confused between the two. So it's a really, really great progression, and it goes like this. And what that's doing, if we're in the scale of A minor, is we're playing chord 1, chord 5 in its natural form without that note there, and then we go to chord 7, chord 4, chord 1, chord 5 in its minor form, chord 7, chord 4. And that gives a really, really lovely sound. If we were to change that to a major chord 5, it wouldn't work. Maybe, but certainly not. It's not good for the time progression. The time progression is defined by that feeling of going this kind of empty floating chord 5. So that's a little clarification to realize that that chord can change sometimes in minor keys. So we're still diatonic. We're still inside of a major or a minor key, and yet we still have a huge amount of expression whilst using this tension and resolution principle in our melodies. So I'm going to work inside of the scale of E minor, which is the relative minor of G major, and I'm going to write out the chord tones, the chord tones that we had before on the piano, and then we're going to talk about the non-chord tones, okay? So obviously if these are the chord tones, we have 4 other notes that are non-chord tones, right? It's this one, and this one, and also this one, sorry. Those ones. Let's look at that in C major, if that was a bit too hard for you. So C major, here are our chord tones. So our non-chord tones are, and if I play those over a chord of C major, listen to what they sound like. So each of those, if we're thinking really classically here, gives a certain amount of tension, and it often wants to resolve to one of the other notes. So a kind of simple way to write a melody would be to go to mix and match those notes. So let's try it in E minor again. Now you can decide to begin with tension or begin with resolution. Here I'm going to begin with resolution. Then tension, tension, resolution, resolution, tension, 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 resolution, 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 tension, resolution, resolution, tension, tension, resolution. You get the idea. So use this in all of your keys to start creating some interesting melodies. Then if you combine that with your chord progressions, you get some really useful stuff straight away. So let's go back into C major so you can really see this. I'm going to do my chord progression of 2, 5, and 1. And I'm going to do these ideas. I'll talk you through it. So resolution, tension, resolution, tension. Now, because I've moved on to chord 5, this is now resolution. Resolution. So you have this interesting relationship where for chord 2 here, this note was tension, but then when we change the chord underneath it, that note becomes resolution. And then if I keep that note, it becomes tension again. So we'll get to this later on in further chapters. That what I was doing there was called a pedal note, and it joins chords together and makes them kind of interact and be almost compared with each other side by side. So yeah, hope that's useful. Enjoy your composing, and I'll see you in the next video. So let's start with the feeling of resolution. If we're playing a chord, here's F major, the notes of that chord work particularly well inside our melody. So we've got this chord here, and then the following notes are the chord tones. So for example, if we created a melody that's made entirely of those chord tones, I mean, this sounds really plain and a bit boring now, but if you had someone singing this, an amazing, gospel singer, and then, you had someone just doing some more interesting voicing, and they're going, it would sound good, right? So don't underestimate at this point, how the simplicity of this will sound actually quite good once you arrange it properly. So planning at this point doesn't have to sound good, but it's quite logical to use notes from the chord. But then if we change chords, so here's chord 2, and then we highlight all the chord tones of that chord, which is basically these notes all the way up the piano, then our melody could use chord tones from that chord. So we could write a melody really simply that would be right? And that is actually a really good first way of composing. So if we do that inside of G major again, here's chord 2. That's very similar to Mad World there, actually, if you've heard that tune. So play around with chord tones inside of your keys, also your minor keys as well, and try and come up with some melodies. What you'll find immediately, and we'll discover this in the next video, is that you'll almost certainly want to move to notes that aren't just the chord tones. And this is where you have that kind of tension and resolution thing coming back in, because chord tones are quite static. We don't want to move anywhere necessarily. Here, all these notes are quite static, but if I play a non-chord tone, so like this one, it's beautiful. I absolutely love that, and I could stay on that all day. I love that sound. But you kind of have to admit from a real kind of standard theoretical perspective that this wants to move somewhere else, which is, classically speaking, to a chord tone. So you want to resolve it. Another one here would be, here's our G major chord and our chord tones. And then we want to play this note, which is a non-chord tone, and it wants to resolve up to that G, which is a chord tone. So I'll see you in the next video where we do non-chord tones. So in this section, we're primarily looking at melody over the top of harmony. But before we do that, I want to introduce a concept which is relevant throughout this course and how you compose, which is tension and resolution. It's a bit like the idea of gravity in a key. It's kind of loosely connected, but more granular and more detailed into how you are actually constructing your melodies and harmonies. Basically, it's not necessarily the only way to think about how you're composing. It's one way to frame what you're trying to create with the idea of how much tension and how much resolution, because depending on your taste in music, we like a certain amount of tension and resolution. So let me show you what I mean. So this chord here, relatively stable, right? But if I add one note to it, maybe, there's something about this chord that is making us want to move to somewhere else. And if I resolve that, don't worry about what that word means, it's kind of essentially resolving the tension, finishing the tension. Now we've finished, right? And that sounds a bit classical and obvious there. But essentially, when you do chord 1, 4, 5, that's tension that wants to be resolved to resolution, for want of another word. And as you're writing both your melodies and your harmonies, you want to be thinking, well, how much is this tension and resolution working? In a sense, it's if you're finding that something isn't working, you could kind of just ask yourself the question, okay, what's the balance of tension and resolution? Have I got enough tension? Have I got enough resolution? Is there too much of one, too much of the other? Because if you're writing a piece of music, I'm just going to go in C major, that's like this all the time. Right? 2 minutes later, you're like, right? It's so boring because we're just in this feeling of resolution. But if you add some other stuff, right? There's some kind of mixing of stuff going on in there. So let's have a look. That was with harmony, right? And then we'll get more into what chords create what kind of tension. You kind of already know that we've been looking at so far. But what about melody, right? You've got something going on here. That note there feels like it's not quite as stable as the first two. So that melody is leading us up from resolution into tension and into resolution. So in this whole chapter, we're going to look at particularly melody in harmony, both chord tones and non-chord tones and more. But the whole time be thinking, right, how can I use this in my work? Go and apply, make little sketches after each episode in this part of the course. Kind of taking the idea of like chord tones, non-chord tones, non-diatonic tones as well, and see how you can start constructing melodies with these different flavors and feelings under the whole heading of tension and resolution and what's right for you and your style of music. So far we've looked at diatonic tones. Yes, they might not be member of the chord, but they are all diatonic in the key. Now we're going to add another level of tension, which is non-diatonic tones. Again, let's be simple, stay inside of C major. So here are all our diatonic tones, and very simply you can see all the black notes are our non-diatonic tones. Right? And they really, generally speaking, don't work, at least in the way that I'm playing it at the moment with simple root position triad voicings. They're kind of a bit funky in a bad way. But you can make them funky in a good way if you use them in the right way. Okay, so one of the things that we'll look at in a later chapter is kind of ornamentation, which is basically, instead of playing a melody like this, you could add, say, so these two notes, it's a very simple example there, these two notes are just short grace notes, we call them, before those notes. And you can use grace notes with non-diatonic tones because they happen very quickly, right? So let's say our melody goes, you could go, right? You see I slipped past and played that non-diatonic tone. And that one works particularly well. What we've got there is we go 1, 2, 3, and then we go down a semitone to the, what's called a minor third. You don't necessarily need to know that, but... So experiment now with your melodies and seeing whether some non-diatonic tones work well in this grace note format. You do get quite a jazzy style when you do that semitone one there, but you might find some other ones, like this one here. It's quite a creepy one. You get a very, very different sound when you use non-diatonic tones, but you have to learn yourself which ones work best. As I said, the one with a major chord there where you take the third note and you go down a semitone gives you a jazzy sound. What I did just then was I played a minor chord, here's D minor, and I played the note which is a semitone below D. We'll get to what that's actually called. It's called a major seventh in later chapters, but for now you can just think of it in terms of the pattern. Here I went to number 5 from D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I went down a semitone, and that note is not in this key. Similarly, this note wouldn't be in this key if we're inside C major. And there I played this one, which is a semitone above D. Have fun with that and see if you can come up with some more structures and flavors that add difference to your melody, but probably a word of warning is use it sparingly.